2 balls and a strike to count on Taylor. Reyes fires, swinging a drive, deep left field. This is way back. Welcome on, Chris Taylor.
What's up, everybody? Welcome into DodgerHeads, presented by DodgerBlue.com. My name is Jeff Spiegel, joined today by a special guest, Fabian Ardaya of The Athletic, my favorite guy to follow when it comes to Dodger stuff. Fabian, I appreciate you joining us. I know the All-Star game was in Los Angeles, so I'm guessing you didn't get much of an All-Star break, huh?
Not too much. Apparently, there's this guy named Juan Soto that everyone keeps talking about. So,
yeah, geez, it was your colleague. It's Ken Rosenthal's fault. Have you gone after Ken and said, Ken, I needed 3 days off, and you gave me none?
No, I have told him multiple times, though. He has ruined multiple of my days just with some of his breaking news posts.
Yeah, well, I joke. I mean, we are partnered with a Lakers website, and I joked the other day that I laugh at them because they could post Kyrie Irving videos 6 times a day, and it's like the views just skyrocket. It's the NBA. It's all anyone wants to talk about. I say, you know what? Ken gave us some of that. I can get on here and talk about Juan Soto whenever I want, and people will click. I know you had a great article that went up Monday night about Juan Soto, and so it's got to be a little bit, good for business. Gives you something to talk about, right? Rather than just the Dodgers won again.
Oh, it's definitely more interesting when the team is actively pursuing someone at the trade deadline as opposed to like a more quiet one, which I was kind of expecting to be the case for the Dodgers before Juan Soto became available.
Awesome. Well, the nice thing about covering the Dodgers right now is that they keep winning baseball games. Of course, they didn't win on Monday night, but let me start. This show is sort of going to be a mailbag of sorts. You do a lot of mailbags over at The Athletic, which I love because it covers a wide range of topics. There's a ton to get to. Juan Soto, of course, Luis Castillo, Trey Thompson, and Jake Lamb, some prospect stuff. But let me start with just kind of a big picture question. This team, from my perspective, something has clicked in the last 3 or 4 weeks. There was a stretch where the record was the best, the stats were the best, but, the eye test didn't necessarily match up. Now the eye test and the wins seem to be in sync. You're a guy who's around this team pretty much every day. Did something change? Like, have you felt a tangible difference inside the clubhouse over the last month?
Well, there definitely has been a difference with how they played. I think there was about a little bit more than a month ago when they were in San Francisco. They got swept right before that last game. He sort of just coming into that game, we were talking to Dave Roberts. He was visibly irritated just before that game, and I think we were asking, it was after Walker Buehler's MRI results were coming in or as they were coming in. So we were just going to ask about that. And he sort of goes into an answer about Walker and then sort of shifts gears, starts talking about the team, the offense, how he doesn't feel like they've been playing enough team baseball, enough connected offensive baseball to win baseball games. And that was sort of a trend over the course of that weekend in San Francisco. They left a lot of runners on base. They had been doing that for a little while. I think sort of ever since then, they've started to shift and turn things on a little bit. I don't know if it's necessarily that specifically, but it's just around that time they started to really pick up sort of 1 through 9, not just obviously guys getting hot, but also just some of the stuff that fans love. They look for just sort of like moving guys over, bringing them in, using some of this lineup depth to really add on and tack on, so they didn't really necessarily have to rely as much on their starting rotation. But of course, that rotation's been there all season long this season. So I think that's why they've been on this really hot stretch. I think they've still won, I think it was like 27 of their last 35 games.
Yeah, which seems, I don't know, from my vantage point, seems pretty good. At one point, they had the best record in baseball. I'm not sure that if by losing the other night, they gave that back. But yeah, you mentioned, one of the things you mentioned was lineup depth, and I'll just jump in right there. Lineup depth, from my perspective, over the last month starts with Jake Lamb and Trey Thompson. These are 2 guys that anybody in baseball could have had. Trey Thompson was available basically for free. Jake Lamb signed a minor league deal with the Dodgers. You look at what these guys have done. Trey Thompson, as of Tuesday morning, batting average 300. He's got a 923 OPS in 26 games. He's got 10 extra base hits, 14 RBIs, and plays a competent left field, which the Dodgers have needed. Then you've got Jake Lamb, who's got an 853 OPS in 18 games with 6 extra base hits. There's a lot of different directions that I could go with a question around these 2 guys and Chris Taylor and all of that, but let me start with the broadest version of it. Are you buying some version of what Jake Lamb and Trey Thompson are doing as sustainable?
I think some version of it for sure. Like, I think if you're sort of mapping out ahead a future where Chris Taylor's healthy and the rest of the lineup stays healthy, all of a sudden you're looking at a bench that's significantly better than it was this time last year, which was a massive hole for that team last year. you're looking at a situation where like you probably feel a lot better with Jake Lamb or Trace Thompson taking important October bats than you were than for like Steven Souza Jr. or some of those guys last year towards the stretch. So I'm buying that. I'm not sure that Trace Thompson's gonna have a 900 OPS the rest of the way, or that he's gonna run away with the left fielder's job. But like they've managed to absorb Chris Taylor's absence way better than anyone could have anticipated. It timed out really well. Some of this hot stretch from both of those guys sort of came as Chris Taylor and Mookie Betts were hurt. And it's really helped the Dodgers be in the position that they're in. And I think it sort of allows them to maybe be a little bit more focused going into this deadline. They don't need another right-handed bat, but they could use one. But I think it's different when you're not in a position where you absolutely have to make a move.
Yeah, and let me ask sort of the follow-up question that I don't know if I'm the only person that's thinking quietly, and I'll say out loud. Chris Taylor's due back. He has been the everyday left fielder. He has not been very good this year, striking out at like a historic rate, it feels like. I mean, is it as simple as Chris Taylor's just your everyday left fielder again, and Jake Lamb and Trace Thompson are coming off the bench? Or does it get a little more complicated than that?
I do think it is sort of like that from at least from the start, because I think you mentioned Chris Taylor strikeouts. Yeah, he's striking out more than almost anyone in baseball, but the overall numbers are still fine. Like he's still putting together like a league average type offensive profile, because when he does put the ball in play, it's usually an extra base hit somewhere. I think they value sort of his presence in their lineup, what he brings, some of the other things he brings. I know he hasn't quite been able to bounce around the infield like he has in years past just because of the elbow issue. Maybe this time away from throwing regularly helps with that. But I think he's still going to be main guy in left field. This might open up more opportunities to move Chris Taylor possibly to center, and maybe like you're more willing to give someone like Cody Bellinger a day off, or have him come off the bench, be a defensive replacement, something like that, just because they do value Cody Bellinger's defense, but that bat is still struggling at this point.
Yeah, and I guess the other one would be Max Muncy as the designated hitter. You know, I wonder if Bellinger and Muncy are the two guys that maybe, you know, it's not going to be like a full-on platoon, but maybe it's, 2 days off a week instead of 1 day off a week for a couple guys that are really struggling. I mean, in either of those guys, Muncy or Bellinger, do you have some degree of confidence that this is going to turn itself around?
I think it's still, like, I think we're at the point where it's end of July and we're still waiting on these guys to turn things around. I think we've seen some glimmers from Muncy here and there, and he's still drawing some walks, but on the whole, like, he still looks very lost in the season. I think the last week or so we've seen it sort of drift into his defense as well. Bellinger's defense and base running for the last 2 years, even as his bat has been sort of lost, has been a very consistent player on the defensive side of the ball, base running, very, like, probably better defensive center fielders in baseball, so the Dodgers still value that. And Bellinger can still run into one every once in a while, as we saw last week.
Yeah.
I don't think they necessarily feel like – I don't know how confident they are in Bellinger's ability to necessarily turn things around this season. I don't think that they're expecting any sort of MVP-level performance from him. But as long as he's in a position where he's in that happy medium that he was in last October, where he's more survival mode, able to sort of swing a game every once in a while, but as long as he's playing solid defense, they're going to keep rolling him out there.
Let me make a slight detour here while we're talking about Bellinger. Next year, the Dodgers have an incredibly fascinating decision to make about Cody Bellinger. He's going into his final year of arbitration. He's due to make what seems like a minimum of about $18.5 million on what would be just a one-year contract. Do you think that situation gets complicated at all, or do you think the Dodgers just pick it up and pay him in arbitration and kick the can down the road for another year?
I mean, they brought him back last year. I think that's the thing. So I think obviously it depends on where the payroll situation is, stuff like that. I mean, they have a lot of money coming off the books this winter. Anyways, they have some other critical decisions, like Max Muncy has a club option after this winter as well. Turner. So they have a lot of critical decisions to make going forward that could help clear some salary and allow them to absorb that. But obviously, I mean, they are in a position where, like, all right, what is this guy? What is he going to make on the open market? I'm not sure what any GM would throw at Cody Bellinger this winter if he was a free agent. I think there's going to be some that are going to be betting on the upside, just get him out of there. Obviously, his MVP level upside. There's also going to be some that think, all right, this is a guy who's just not the same player after shoulder surgery. Yeah. So we'll see. I think that was one of the things I kind of like floated. I haven't. Obviously, it's not like tangibly reported or anything like that. It's just like a floated possibility of Soto in the Soto trade, maybe seeing if they take on Bellinger to help offset some salary, but also that sort of clears a decision for the Dodgers this winter as well. If that happens, I don't think that happens, but it's just sort of one of those things that was bouncing around in my head. Was just being able to see if that's a way to balance out salaries. Nationals would decide, obviously, get a couple months with him, see what they think of him, and let that be their decision. We'll see. I mean, I do think that they bring him back for next season. I don't think they non-tender him at this point, but obviously, like you mentioned, it's going to be pretty costly. And this is a guy who defensively has been great, base running has been solid, but just hasn't been the same offensive player the last couple of years.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Matt Moreno, one of our guys, was on our show the other night saying, the Dodgers actually probably value Bellinger more than anyone because they can afford to pay a guy just to be a great defensive center fielder and base run well and sort of run into one every once in a while. So it's almost like, would the Dodgers explore extension talks, as crazy as that sounds? But where is Cody's head at as far as what's he's worth? Like, can you get him on a 4-year, $50 million extension? Obviously, not factoring in the $18.5 million he knows he's due, but could you get, a few, I don't know, market value, below market value years after that? I don't know. I just think, I know we're in the middle of a season, so we can keep talking about what's actually going on the field, but that's one that keeps coming up to me that I'm like, I am so interested to see how they handle that one. We talked about the bench real quick and how confident they are. Let me shift to sort of a prospect question here. Michael Busch and Miguel Vargas. These are two prospects the Dodgers have at the minor league level that are bats, and they're crushing it. Miguel Vargas, 875 OPS. He's a 22-year-old in AAA. I retweeted a part of your story about him where the coach said, hey, you don't have to take an 0-1 pitch when a guy's stealing, and he says he had nothing that he could get me out with. As soon as I read that, I was like, I was 75% in on Miguel Vargas, and then I read that. Now I'm 120% in on Miguel Vargas. You've also got Michael Busch, who has an 813 OPS at AAA. He had a 1100 OPS at AA. He's got 22 home runs in 85 games. Are you hearing anything about whether either of these guys are going to be late season, even postseason type contributors for the Dodgers?
I think Vargas is the one of those two that probably has the highest likelihood of that happening just because of the bat, how advanced it is, and sort of the fact that he's been doing this at AAA all season long, whereas Busch came up midway through the year. And obviously, like, he fits a role that would be very easy to foresee for the Dodgers, is just that sort of high upside bat. I'm not sure if there's a clean way to insert him into the roster, though, because I think the part of it is they when they call him up, they want him to sort of have that everyday kind of role, and it might be at third base, but Justin Turner, before he got injured, was sort of turning things around a little bit. Left field, like we already mentioned, like there's three guys who they probably are expecting some sort of production from between Chris Taylor, Trace Thompson, and Jake Lamb. So there's not necessarily a clear-cut role, but I do think that if some guys go down, if they feel like they need some infusion late in the season, I think Vargas is the type of guy they go for. They go bring up just because obviously the upside is there. They really feel confident about the bat to ball, the at-bat quality. Even for a guy who's just 22 years old, they feel like he can adjust to big league pitching pretty well and can handle velocity very well, which is obviously key in a postseason series because you're going to have all these hard-throwing relievers coming at you.
On the pitching side, obviously we've seen Pepio, we've seen Grove, Bobby Miller's the other name. I mean, any of those guys you see being late season, maybe move to the bullpen type guys?
I think it depends on who comes back healthy from the rest of the rotation in the bullpen. I think it still remains to be seen what Walker Buehler can bring. He started the throwing program yesterday. Dustin May's on a rehab assignment. Both those guys are sort of pegging to be starters when they come back, but obviously with either of those guys, if there's even a slight setback, we'll see if they're even able to be fully stretched out. If they're not, then they'll be part of the bullpen. They're still trying to slowly bring back Blake Trinan. They sort of view this as they have one shot to get this right, so they're going to be really extra cautious with that. Tommy Kahnle, Danny Duffy, Victor Gonzalez, similar situation. So if you can get multiple of those guys back, you're not going to have as much of a need for that. I'm curious to see what they do if they don't, just because obviously Pepio's had some issues throwing strikes, which might be a problem in the bullpen, but obviously his stuff is able to get swings and misses, so maybe if they can lock some things in there. I don't think they bring up Bobby Miller at this point, but obviously the stuff is very enticing. And obviously, if you have a guy who's throwing 101 coming out of your bullpen, that's going to help. And maybe that convinces them to give him at least a shot in September to see what he has. But obviously, in Double-A, the numbers haven't been great he's been striking out a lot of guys, but he's still working through some stuff with like his fastball shape, pitch usage, stuff like that. I don't know if they want to necessarily potentially harm his development in doing that.
Yeah. Well, okay, you perfect segue, Fabian, into my next question, which was the bullpen and the absolute mystery grab bag that the Dodgers are staring at. Treinen's the big one, so I'll ask you about him first. Am I the only one that thinks that this has been a very confusing, mysterious process with Blake Treinen? Because it's like nobody really knows what's happening. He sort of is saying like, you know, pumping the brakes on any sort of update, even after he threw a positive bullpen on Sunday. Like, where you're around the team, you're asking people questions. Like, do you have any degree of confidence that this is going to work out for Treinen this year?
Well, we still have not gotten a formal diagnosis on what's wrong.
Totally. It's so bizarre.
That's the problem. That's the problem. I mean, that's part of, like, obviously why I can't necessarily speak all that. Certainly, I think the fact that he's throwing bullpens is a good enough sign that he hasn't had the fact that he hasn't required surgery, that they felt confident enough to sort of guarantee next year as well. Yeah,
that was the other weird part.
I think that's urging some sort of caution there, that they don't feel like it's something that like is super serious, but something that they definitely don't want to push. So, I mean, he's throwing bullpens right now. I think if he comes out of this next bullpen well, then he'll be able to face hitters for the first time. And I think that's when he faces hitters, and once he starts getting into rehab games, that's when we'll really have a gauge on like how likely this is that he'll be able to come back and what he looks like. So
yeah,
obviously it's still one of those things the Dodgers can have, but I'm not sure. I think until he's like actually pitching in rehab games and actually close to being activated, I think it's safe to assume that like he's someone who's a maybe, but definitely not a definitely.
And that's what's so interesting, because you mentioned the other names, Canely, Duffy, Gratterall, Gonzalez, and Gratterall maybe doesn't belong in that category, but you've got a bunch of maybes in a bullpen, and the trade deadline is like 10 days away, less than 10 days away from where we sit today. And so I have argued the whole time that if it were me, a bullpen move, this was pre-Juan Soto, would be my priority. They need to get somebody, at least one, maybe even two guys that you can throw in the back of the bullpen and trust in the 7th, 8th, and 9th innings of postseason games. Now, if you tell me Treinen's going to come back and Gratterall is going to be healthy and you get even one of Canely or Duffy, then I'm like, all right, then maybe we don't need to go make a move. But the Dodgers are in a crazy spot where they've got to figure out, we've got 4 or 5 maybes, and we've got a couple definite holes. Do we trade to solve those problems? Do we bank on the relief guys coming back healthy? How do you think this plays out for the Dodgers? I mean, obviously it's a ton of projection, and that's what it's a risk and it's a gamble one way or the other. It feels like you would rather risk on the side of having too many relievers come October than too few. But what do you think Friedman does with this?
Well, I do know for a fact that he hates trading for relievers.
Yes, that's the other thing.
He has said that as such. I do think that they maybe add 1 or 2 guys who they like, sort of like the Evan Phillips types, where like you see them, okay. They have a couple of traits that they really like, and they really feel like this pitching development can sort of refine. I don't think they're necessarily going to go after one of the big name late inning relievers. I mean, if they do trade for like David Robertson, like I wouldn't be too surprised, but I wouldn't expect it. I feel like they're going to do more stuff to sort of shore up the depth rather than add on the high end, because I feel like they feel confident in their ability to sort of generate that from within. But yeah, I mean, they could use insurance in that case. And I think also there's going to be, even as the rotation gets healthier, we'll see what Andrew Heaney's able to provide. If that kicks Mitch White to the bullpen, if maybe Andrew Heaney becomes a bullpen option, if his shoulder doesn't cooperate. So like, there's a lot of different factors that can go forward. I think they're just worried about sort of compiling arms as opposed to like they need a late inning reliever or they need another starter. I think they could sort of see guys who sort of fit in between the middle, and they can sort of maximize those guys.
Yeah, it seems like both at the bullpen level and the rotation level, you've got like, okay, we've got these 5 or 6 guys that are all question marks. Can we bank on 2 of you guys figuring it out? Like on the starting rotation, it's like we got 8. Can we find 4 of you guys that we trust in October? One other question, and this is something that in talking to our prospect guy and thinking through, the Dodgers, the 40-man roster is a really interesting spot because they had to protect 5 young guys last year. Then they added Pepio, and there's about 7 more guys that are their top prospects, even higher rated than the 5 guys they added last year, that needed to be added next year. Have you gotten any sense that there's urgency? Maybe urgency is the wrong word, but I mean, we're talking about 6 months from now, the Dodgers are going to have way too many of these young guys that they need to have on the 40-man roster. And I've said part of the reason I think they're going to make a couple trades is just because they've got to move some of these guys. They're going to have to open up 40-man roster spots, and you want to get something for them. Have you heard anything along those lines or sensed that at all from the Dodgers?
No, but like, there's been like a similar thought process I feel like I've had. It's more like not necessarily that they have to make a move just to get rid of these guys and clear spots, but like if they are going to make a move, they probably will be more willing to part with some of the guys already on the 40-man roster than most teams typically would, just because they have such a backlog of guys. So, like, that's why, like, whenever they've been asking me for like a trade projection for like a Castillo trade, like, I'll throw like a James Outman in there. Guys who are already on the 40-man roster, just because it makes things easier for the Dodgers to absorb going forward. But also, like, they can still move those guys or move guys who they have to add to the 40-man, but they don't have a spot for. They can move those guys in the winter too, as long as it's before November. I do think that that's going to lead to some Dodgers movement at some point. I don't know if it's necessarily going to be at this deadline.
Hey, and there's a guy named Juan Soto who would take a bunch of those guys off the 40-man roster or the future 40-man roster. So I have one more question, then we're going to get to Soto. Starting pitching, let's get to this one really quickly. It's kind of what I just hinted at. Personally, I'm fine with the group that they have. I don't see the need to go out and add a starting pitcher. I look at Kershaw, Urias, Gonsolin, Anderson, May, Buehler, Heaney, and White, and I basically ask myself, can I find 4 guys in that group that I trust in October? And for me, the answer is yes. How do you feel about that group? Do you feel like they need to go out and add a Luis Castillo type to that group? Or do you look and say, all right, Kershaw, do we trust his health? Urias is probably the guy you trust the most, just because he's been there, done that. Gonsolin started to struggle lately. Anderson has pitched a ton of innings before and has sustained success thus far. And then do we get anything out of May, Buehler, Heaney, and White? Where are you at on starting pitching?
Yeah, I think it's sort of similar, like where I feel like I don't know if they have necessarily a guy that they trust in the game one at this point, just because like we have to get Kershaw to October health wise. Julio Urias has been able to be really good in the regular season, but like going a third time through the order in the postseason, I'm not sure that's something that he's earned that trust yet. And then obviously we still have to see what Tony Gonsolin is come September, what Tyler Anderson's able to sustain. Like there's a lot of guys who have had really strong first halves and their stuff works in the regular season, but do they have that sort of elite top high-end postseason stuff? I think that's the only way this rotation improves at the deadline is if they sort of can add that type of Castillo or Montas or Pablo Lopez type. But I don't necessarily think they need to do that. I'm saying that's the only way they tangibly improve that group. Because I think depth-wise, they're fine. They're in a decent enough spot to get through the rest of the season. And I think that they have enough options where like you feel relatively comfortable with them starting a postseason game. And we'll see how Buehler comes back, how May comes back. That'll probably change that if both those guys come back and are at full strength and basically what they were pre-injury, or Buehler like what he was last year. So if you can get sort of back to that level, that changes things. But we'll see. I mean, there also might be guys who in the rotation who pop into the bullpen like we've seen years past with Julio Urias. So we'll see how this sort of navigates itself.
Have you heard anything on the names that you just mentioned, Montas, Castillo, and Pablo Lopez? Because you mentioned Pablo Lopez. That's a guy that I actually talked about seeing a potential real fit between what the Marlins need, which is kind of like, quad A, major league level type players that the Dodgers actually could offer in a trade for Lopez. Have you heard anything on any of those 3 guys?
I think the asking price is just really high on all of them, no matter what, just considering that those are controllable guys who there's not like a rental Max Scherzer level guy who's available. So those are all controllable guys. The cost is going to be really high. I think part of his teams are kind of waiting on to see how Juan Soto's market shakes out, because those are a lot of the same resources you'd have to use. Obviously not nearly as many, but those are some similar resources. And I think, honestly, if you're looking ahead to the Dodgers sort of deadline, it's going to be like Juan Soto is going to be a guy who they're going to be in on. I'm not sure how optimistic they are they're going to land him, just because it's such a high cost. But I think that's the big move I see them making. I think if they don't get Juan Soto, I wouldn't be surprised if it's a relatively quiet deadline.
Okay. Well, let's get to the elephant in the room, Juan Soto, and I'll just put you on the spot. percentage chance that the Dodgers land Juan Soto before the trade deadline this year is what?
Well, is it a cop-out to say the same percentage I would have given them trading for Trea Turner and Max Scherzer last year?
What was that number? Do we have a number on that?
I didn't have a number on that, but like I don't know, like maybe like 5%. Like I just
Okay.
because there still is like such a high band of outcomes where like that. I mean, the Nationals could keep him, and I think that's still the most likely scenario, just because it's always easier to project that the guy's going to stay on the team that he's currently on. Yeah. So I think that's probably the most likely scenario, and obviously there's going to be a lot of different teams that have similar packages or similar resources, maybe not both in the same way that the Dodgers do, or if you're the Mets, they do have both, but also they're in the same division. So I think there's just so many teams out there that it's hard to predict how aggressive 8 different GMs are going to be and which one's going to be aggressive enough to pull the trigger on what the Nationals want.
Have you heard? I mean, are the Dodgers? Do you get the sense that they are, active? I guess this is all language that could mean 100 different things. Are the Dodgers kicking the tires on this? Are they actively pursuing this? How would you describe where they are at? Because obviously we know the media narrative. Juan Soto's available. Immediately it becomes he's going to go to the Dodgers. Andrew Friedman, Brandon Gomes are getting asked about it. Like, do you think this is just doing their due diligence? Or do you think that Andrew Friedman is seriously, going down a road that he doesn't go down with every guy that becomes available on the free agent market?
I get the sense, and this is just sort of my read on it, is sort of that they're listening, they're going to be around, and at the right price, they'll absolutely do it, and they'll jump. But they don't feel like they have the urgency like that they need to go and make the move and possibly overpay. Okay. Obviously, no matter what, you're going to have to pay a lot to get them. But I think they sort of approaching it the way they approach free agency, the way they approach a lot of different things. Like they have their price, they're going to stick to it, and they'll see how the rest of the market shakes out. I think that's some of how the Scherzer trade came to pass last summer. I think they didn't go into it expecting to get both those guys, but the right offer came at the right price, and they made that move. And they weren't necessarily at the front of the Scherzer sweepstakes either at the start. Obviously, like the Padres, the Giants were all both into it. So, and the Dodgers were just sort of on the periphery as they usually are. There's been obviously cases in years past where they've been sort of seen as the logical destination or the only destination. If you're I'm thinking like the Manny Machado trade where like they were the contender that needed a shortstop. It made all the sense in the world, and they were in a sense kind of negotiating against themselves just because there wasn't much of a market outside of that.
Yeah.
But that's obviously not the case for Soto. So I think they're going to be around it. They're interested in Juan Soto. They obviously realize the type of impact he would have on this team, not just for this year, but the next 2 postseason runs after that. So I think they're going to be obviously engaged till the end, but I don't know if they're going to necessarily be pushed to be as aggressive as other GMs are.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Last thing. I know yesterday, Monday night, you were talking to Trea Turner, Andrew Friedman, got a chance to ask them some questions. As I said, folks, if you haven't already subscribed to The Athletic, Fabian's stuff on the Dodgers is my favorite beat reporter to follow, and it's worth it. He's got a great article up Monday night about this. Was there anything in particular from those 2 interviews with Trea Turner and Andrew Friedman that jumped out at you?
Not necessarily. I think it's more like this is just sort of what the Dodgers do. When the guy is available, they're going to be around. And I think Trea Turner kind of put it simply as like they shouldn't have Freddie Freeman. They shouldn't have Mookie Betts, but they do because this is what the franchise does. And that's sort of the position they've continually found themselves in. I think that's probably what Andrew Friedman is sort of juggling as well. It's like, all right, like how can they make this move and still be in position for the next superstar to become available? Because they don't become available all that often, but when they do, they want to be at least in the mix. So
yeah.
I know they have a deep farm system. I know Keith Law ranked as number 1 in baseball. Obviously, they have some potential start-level talents in there. But how many of those guys can they move and still be able to introduce this next wave and still have enough young players come through and break through to the big leagues and be productive while they're cheap and young? So it's all stuff that they're trying to balance. But obviously, you're looking at a guy who's 23 years old, and you have at least 3 more years of him.
Yeah. Yeah, trade them all, Fabian. That's my idea. Trade them all. Just get Juan Soto in the Dodger blue. So, hey, Fabian, we appreciate your time again. I know in the middle of the season that you've got a ton going on. So, thank you. You guys can check out Fabian's stuff on Twitter. And as I've said multiple times, The Athletic, they're the best. So, thanks for your time, Fabian. Enjoy the rest of the season.
Thanks for having me.